got some great questions brought in. I'm excited. If you guys still want to be sending in some questions, you can still be sending in some questions, I think, as we go on here. I'm going to do, you said you'd rather talk for 40 minutes than answer questions from random passersby. So we're going to bring you out of your comfort zone a little bit.
Okay, sure.
I guess I'll let you rest for a little bit. I'll start with George, because we put this conference together, and we got a couple of questions both during your talk and during Paul's talk. But I guess I'll start out with a big one. In a world of 10,000 religions, why does anything have to be the only way? Or does something have to be the only way in a world of 10,000 religions?
Is this on? No.
Hello? It may not be. Here, it's right. There you
go. I'll say a few ramblings and then Paul can give the right answer, probably. The only way doesn't mean it has to be something particularly simple, but if in fact there is a God, I mean, either there's a God who exists who's like this or like that. I mean, there has to be, in a sense, a type of answer or a stream of answers. I don't know if that's a very, very clear answer. I'm trying to
Well, I wish Leah was here because I think her life is one of the answers. I think for many people, many Christian apologists, they put so much of their stock, understandably, on propositional truth, as if that's what's going to make the difference. Yes and no. I think, you know what, if all Christians basically said, we're all about health and wealth and building my own empire, building my own tribe, Christianity will lose its credibility structure so quickly. And I think it is people like Leah and others, numerous others among us, who are giving up their lives and giving up our comfort in order to really make you better, make those who are materially impoverished to be a little bit better clothed and better fed. And I think it is those acts of Christians, as we have the fifth book in the New Testament as Acts, the acts of the Christian community that really gives a greater credibility to the story and the claims of Jesus, who said himself, I am the only way and the truth and the life. So I do think that the Christian community will do much better if they will continue to do a kind of a dual pursuit. It's not just having dig and delve, but also having a kind of food drive, a clothing, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing that would actually, and I know you guys do it, the Canadians seem to do it a lot better than Americans do, but doing that kind of a both and rather than either or. And I think that to me is, at least for me, I think there are moments when I get really disillusioned about Christians because I look at myself and says, I'm really disillusioned about me. But then when I see other Christians living that and talking that talk, and walking that talk, that really gives me hope. And that, I think, to me, helps me in my journey. And I think being an evangelical Christian in a secular university is a very lonely thing. And in some ways I feel like, is it worth it? Like, what am I doing this for? And then I hear the stories from you and from the anonymous brother on the YouTube's video, as well as Leah and as well as many others. That really helps me to know, okay, Christ's claims are true. Yeah. I just have to follow it a little bit better.
I've got my thoughts, yeah. I had a conversation at a coffee place, big surprise, and yeah, I should have a coffee, maybe tomorrow. If I'd been here tomorrow, I would have had a coffee cup with me. And I guess he asked me a little bit, he saw me studying the Bible, and it was around Easter, and we got talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and he said, well, why on earth would anybody even care about that, even if it's true? Like, even if it's true, it's so what? Mm-hmm. And I knew this fellow a bit because we'd had a few conversations. And so I said to him, basically, if all you're concerned with in life is how much money you can make, who you're going to sleep with, how you're going to get power, if those are the only types of questions that motivate you, then the resurrection of Jesus is completely irrelevant. But if you ever come to the point, and some point in time you will get old, when things like money and taste and food and sex and power will start to pale, or if you ever start to wonder if there's something more. Once you ask, is there something more, then you're looking at a way. But if you're not interested in that, if you just want to make as much money as possible, then nothing we're talking about, you haven't even begun to go on a quest if you haven't, but once you go on a quest, there's a way. That's just how it works.
So kind of to drive that question home a little bit more, because I think the question was, why does there have to be one only way? And there's a common objection. Your way is your way. In fact, you have a way that's right for you, and I might have my own way. How would you deal with that objection that, your way might be a way that is your way, and I have my way that is my way?
It implies that the Christian faith is just something like equivalent to what's the best ice cream flavor, which, by the way, is French vanilla, if you didn't know. But if
thought it was cherry and goat cheese.
Yeah, but if you see religion as just something like a taste, then that's a valid question. If there was a bit of a discussion as to what my wife looked like, and you said that my wife is very tall and brunette, and somebody else said my wife is short, and this. I mean, there'd be lots of, but my wife looks like one particular thing. So if in fact there is a real God, he has to have to have a particular character and nature, and that would be my quick answer.
Well, I think having and agreeing with you on that, but I think we might. So this is where I maybe differ from some of us on the stage. I think that both Augustine, who said compella intrare, could be justified in terms of compelling Christians to believe, so coercion of belief, or Bartolome de las Casas in the 16th century, who fought against the kind of Spanish kind of colonial practice of conversion at spear point or gun point. I think, so the story of his history of Christian exclusivism has not yielded the best historical examples, which doesn't mean that we should give it up. So I'm saying, okay, how do we then embody this Christian, the exclusivity of the gospel in a way that makes the gospel more alluring rather than kind of off-putting? And I think that's, you know what I'm saying? So I think it's, again...
That's what I was trying to get at with the wife analogy. That if there is a God that really does exist, you can have wrong descriptions of that God.
Right.
You just can't, if God is a something, not just like a vague idea, then there's going to be things which are more correct and less correct.
Right.
Not exhaustive truth, but true truth.
Sure.
And, but at the end of the day, the fact is the Christian story is so unique because even though we Christians have been terrible at it, God is the profound respecter and guarantor of human freedom.
Sure, absolutely.
And we have to embody that in a very powerful way. But at the same time that he is the guarantor of human freedom, he is that for which human freedom points.
Right.
That we are restless until we rest in him.
Right. I mean, so I teach a graduate seminar, a doctoral seminar in the study of religion, which means how religious studies as a discipline has emerged in the 16th and 17th century and how it is practiced today. And then one of the things that I say is, okay, I'm not trying to, and this is how I underscore it, I'm not trying to prove the superiority or inferiority of any religion, but I say Christianity has this very interesting thing about it, that it has this God that comes down to where we are and dies as a executed criminal in Jesus Christ. I said that's a pretty unique, uniqueness does not mean superiority, but I said, can you acknowledge that that's kind of different from other stories? Again, and I think, getting because most of the students in the classroom tend to be more kind of inclusivist or pluralist, and they said, okay, we can acknowledge that, but we don't want to acknowledge that Christianity alone is true. I said, okay, so what I try to do in my kind of conversations with people who in many ways fundamentally differ from where I start with is at least acknowledging that that's there, that the story of Jesus' incarnation and Jesus' death and resurrection is, to me, really extraordinarily kind of unique. And I think so I usually kind of try to go there and then leave the rest up to the work of the Holy Spirit to convince them, because I think as a historian, I feel like so often when Christians get so excited that you got to believe this, then we sometimes kind of strangle them and says, if you don't believe it, then we're not. I know you Canadians are much better than that, so, but yeah.
Jason, I want to ask a follow-up question that's coming down the line, because you just mentioned it. You said there's a uniqueness to Christianity and that deals with the death of God.
Yes.
And Jason, we have a question that someone sent. Nice plug. Oh, there. It says, why should God be killed to save us? That was a question we received. They just tried to understand from, I think it was from Leah's testimony.
Okay.
Of trying to understand what is this thing with Christianity that God should be killed in order to save us?
Yeah, so there's a 4th century Christian by the name of Athanasius. He writes this pamphlet or treatise called On the Incarnation. And he asks these, what I would regard hilarious questions. These 2 questions he says. Couldn't Jesus simply die of old age? If all was required was death of the Son of God, couldn't he die? I mean, is that a funny question or what? I mean, when I first read that, I was like cracking up. And then the second question that is even funnier is this. Couldn't Jesus die an accidental death? And he says, could Jesus got hit by a donkey in the streets of Jerusalem? And again, humor notwithstanding, what Athanasius is trying to get at is the kind of nature of death that was required, or in the infinite wisdom of God, that God said, this is going to demonstrate the beauty and the gruesome nature of sin and redemption. Right? That it wasn't natural death, it wasn't accidental death, but it was death as propitiation, death as punishment, death on the most gruesome instrument of human execution in the Roman Empire, crucifixion, that's going to satisfy the justice of God, but also demonstrate most infallibly for the fallible human beings that this is how God takes so seriously the nature of God's justice as well as the depth of our human depravity and sinfulness. And for me, that's one of the clearest lessons that I learned from Athanasius about the kind of death that was required to demonstrate the beauty of God's plan to redeem us. And Athanasius says when Jesus stretched, he died and he says this is sort of like a cosmic air purifier. I mean, this is my way of paraphrasing it, but it says when Jesus stretched himself on the cross, he basically provided the purification for entire cosmos and died to redeem us. So there's a kind of real beauty to, and I'm not saying that Athanasius is a universalist, but he really does talk about the sort of the universal scope of the death of Christ that I often as a Calvinist tend to kind of not see as much. This is probably way into
to summarize what you said, the cross or the death of God was necessary to preserve God's justice.
Right.
Because it demonstrated that he takes sin as an offense against his justice.
Yes.
I would just want to add, it's an idea, why should God die to save us, which offends us. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that human beings thought up themselves. But amongst other things, I'll just give you an analogy. Let's say the X-Men is true, and Dr. X is in the room, or somebody like Dr. X, and he freezes everybody. But now we move beyond even his powers, and he clicks on my forehead, and in very quick succession, almost like it's the Matrix and it's Neo, all of the different things that's gone on in my life start to flash before the screen. And you see how I think about myself, you see what I say about people, you see what I dream, you see the things I've done in the past, you just see it. And as it goes on the screen, you increasingly, almost instantly, you would say, how on earth could that man be a pastor? How on earth could that man be a Christian? How on earth could that man still be married to his wife? And it would go on and on and on, and you would get more and more angry and more desiring of justice to come to me. And I would feel that there was no cask too small for me to enter into. And what the gospel says is that when that entire litany has gone through of my entire life, of the different things that I have done and not done and thought and not thought, and it would completely and utterly unmake me to have that revealed. And it's at that point in time that Jesus says, I will take your place.
I'm having trouble. Oh, here we go. This is up on the screen behind us. So I know, Paul, you started your talk referring a book,
Yep.
Good Without God.
Yep.
And just can you speak to that a little bit? There's a question, how would you respond to the many non-Christians who also help others, that people are good without God, or without the Christian God?
I think the imago Dei, the image of God in every human heart, though marred in many ways, still has the residual kind of presence of, it's not completely non-functioning, it is improperly functioning, but there is still properly functioning aspect to the image of God within that allows us in our common grace to participate in the good that we societally or universally construct to be the good, right? So more power to them. I mean, I think so. I have a cousin who's a dear friend, and he's one of the chief transplant surgeons at Boston's Children's Hospital. And he and I were talking, and he went to university together. And when I look at my cousin, he says, "You know what? You need God, because as I'll share tomorrow, I was really lost, in life, but he was, I'm a pretty decent guy, so I really don't need God." And I think sometimes I do wonder, yes, I mean, people who are genuinely kind of pretty decent human beings, they're good, but then they seem to be, because of their goodness, they're prevented from seeing the need for the Savior. And I think you're right. I mean, for many in modern world, to be told that you actually, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to be good enough, therefore you need divine intervention, that really smacks. I mean, it's like it's slapping you across the face of your pride. And I think, if anything, for those non-Christians among us tonight, I really understand how this is really offensive to you. Like, this is nonsense. That guy he doesn't know diddly squat. What does he know? And I would say, yes, you're right. I mean, I think the gospel message is a foolishness to the Greeks. I mean, it does seem that way, and stumbling block for the Jews. And maybe it's the other way around, but you get what I mean. So, yeah.
I think that the Bible explains both, as you put it, the image of God, which is why people, in fact, do lots of good. But at the same time, I said this in a coffee shop just a little while ago, to get a theme. If you see a movie, and in the movie, everything is perfect, don't you instantly know there's something evil behind it? And on one hand, the Bible can account for why it is that we do good, but the other hand, it also accounts for the fact that we know that there's something wrong and broken.
Sure.
The fall. And the Christian faith is not that Christians are good. The Christian faith is a message of God's done something to reconcile us to himself. So there's no Christian should ever claim that Christians are better than other people. Spurgeon said the Christians are just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And that's all that Christians are.
Sweet. In both your talks, you spoke how to go on a quest. You spoke about asking, and what's good about asking the big questions or the grand questions. What would be some of the hard questions that Christians haven't answered yet? Or are there any that you think that Christians we don't have an answer to, or they can't be and won't be answered?
My quick answer is that there's not that much new under the sun that somebody like an Athanasius or an Augustine hasn't in fact thought about already.
Yes.
Even the famous thing, people think of C.S. Lewis coming up with the Lord lunatic and liar analogy, but that actually comes from Athanasius.
Yeah.
So that would be my quick answer.
Well, I think one of the things that people have tried to figure out is what is going to be the age of your body that you're going to receive as a perfected body? No, right? I mean, because if we're going to have an embodied self eschatologically, like throughout eternity, what age body will, I mean, I'm 50 years old, I don't mind sharing my age, and
want a younger one?
I want something a little bit younger. I don't know, because my son who's only 13 can out-throw a baseball, and I was like, this is kind of sad, you know? So people have been trying to figure out that, and the other thing is the nature of the kind of extra dimensionality in Jesus' resurrection body, that how could he walk through the door and without opening the door?
Okay, Mike Lycona is here and he'll explain it tomorrow.
That's right. I know he's here. He'll probably try to explain. But I think, when I was younger, growing up in South Korea, I read a lot of these stuff about like Bermuda Triangle or Chronicles of Narnia, where like you walk through one door and then you enter into the next. And I sometimes wonder, is that what? It's sort of like that, the Flatland, Flatlanders, that's the story of how the extra dimensionality will help you see the nature. So rather than seeing heaven as something that is above us, could it be something that is around that, but you just have to go through that door? I mean, I don't know. And that's been one of the things that have been really kind of pummeling the brains and
There's a lot we don't.
Yeah, sure.
The fact of the matter is, from a Christian point of view, God is infinite.
Yep.
And so it's mystery.
Yep.
And we will spend
Amen.
all of eternity knowing God and not exhausting our knowledge of God. And the more we know him, the more we will have a hunger to know him, as you put it very well, Paul. It's a thirst and a hunger that's not destructive, but creates more thirst and hunger. And as Lewis puts it, the tiniest taste of that thirst, which makes you more thirsty, is the greatest delight.
Yeah.
For which people would sell everything they had if they could have it, what
Sure.
would be in heaven, which they have now. God is beyond us. There'll always be things to know. We will never exhaust knowing him.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, and then maybe a little bit more personal? What's the hardest question for you? What's the question you struggle with? That's a legitimate question that maybe somebody asks you in a coffee shop. And it's just the hardest question. You say, look, I don't know, but I still hold on to Jesus. What is the question?
I'm going to make it sound like I don't have any. I'll answer that first. I'm going to switch it a little bit. For me, I became a Christian in grade 12, and there were quite a number of times in my university and graduate schools where I almost lost my faith. But for me, for my wife, the challenge was between Buddhism and Christianity. But for me, it's not been any of the other religions. For me, it's always been atheism and nihilism. That's always been the challenge for me. And if I was to cease being a Christian, I would be an atheist. I would be a nihilist. And that's always been the challenge and the struggle for me. I've never been tempted by another religion for a variety of different reasons. There's a lot of questions you can't. Part of the problem with having conversations is they want a soundbite answer, whereas really what you have to do is have a relationship with a longer conversation with the person. And the hardest answer is trying to get beneath the superficial question to the real question that's at the human heart. That's the hard part.
I think for me, one of the harder questions has been the silence of God, especially with Cain and Abel. So every time I teach the theodicy seminar, I ask, why didn't God speak to Abel? Right? Because if you read the story of Cain and Abel, God speaks to Cain, right?
And he's the bad one.
Yeah, he's the bad boy. He's the crooked one, and the one who's guilty of fratricide, kills his own brother. God speaks to Cain twice. All God had to do was speak to Abel and say, "Hey, your brother's about to kill you. Run away." Why doesn't God do that? Again, my finite mind, my sinful mind, trying to play tricks with God, perhaps. But then I hear questions like this from students a lot, and I was like, right. And then I think the way that someone else answered it for me was Shusaku Endo's book Silence, which Martin Scorsese recently made a movie about, called Silence. And it's the silence of God in Jesus Christ. I mean, when Jesus cries out for God's speech, my God, why have you forsaken me? God doesn't say to Jesus, this is the one in whom I'm pleased, listen to him. No, at the moment of crucifixion, there's an absolute and eerie and tragic silence of God. And I think the writer of Hebrews answers it for us in a way. I mean, it's a hard question, but then it says the blood of Jesus cries out louder than the blood of Abel, and something to that effect. Yeah. So I think maybe it is that kind of a primordial question of the human heart. Why doesn't God speak to Abel, yet speaks to the sinner and the renegade and the murderer? And that's precisely what God does even today. Yeah. Therefore, in some way, solving and at the same time, further problematizing the issue of theodicy to me.
Okay, quick question, because you've used the word a lot, and somebody asked what, I don't know if you defined it clearly or
theodicy. Okay.
So what is theodicy?
Theodicy simply means justifying the ways of God to humans. Like God had to say, okay, I am omnipotent, meaning I'm all powerful and I'm all loving. Then why is there the problem of evil, right? Because if my child dies at age 5, and let's say I am a father who is all powerful and all loving, wouldn't I do something to prevent that? Has been the kind of issue that's been bedeviling all of human stories since Adam and Eve or whoever it was. I mean, Adam and Eve, yes. So
theodicy is the problem of evil or defending God's justice,
right.
His character.
Right.
Going back to the death of Christ, or the death of God, how did people who lived before Christ benefit from Christ's death? Were people who lived before Jesus able to be saved? How'd that happen?
Pastor?
The Bible isn't an answer book. It's God speaking to our need. And that's what Christians believe. And in the Bible, it's clear that people who are before Jesus are in heaven. In the story of the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah, and the implication are that they are in heaven. So the Bible doesn't explain how the cross works backwards, but it makes it clear that it does. And it's interesting, I'm going through the book of Galatians in my church, and one of the things is that the New Testament says that God preaches the gospel to Abraham. God preaches the gospel to Abraham. So it doesn't explain how it works, it just explains that it happened. It just says it happens. But you see, we don't live before Jesus, so why should it explain that? It speaks to us right here.
You know, last October I was in Istanbul, Turkey, for a couple of lectures, and one of the missionaries there, took me to a church in Kora in Istanbul. It's a beautiful mosaic. It's a Byzantine mosaic of Jesus stepping on Satan, and then on his right and on his left, he's holding the hands of these two individuals. Guess who they might be? Two people that show up early in the Bible, Adam and Eve. So according to this Byzantine tradition, is Jesus' work of salvation crushes the head of the serpent and rescues Adam and Eve as prototypical figures of humanity. So now try to explain that. I didn't try to explain it. I just was mesmerized by the beauty of the mosaic and just profound sense of gratitude that I think, in the end, salvation is mystery. It's not my job to figure out who's in, who's out, because that's where all kinds of problems arose. Saying, okay, we white people are better than black people. This is where all kinds of problems can arise. So I think just leave that entirely up to God, and you should be just thankful that God saved you in Jesus Christ, and joyfully live that out. Are we done yet?
I think we had. I'm going to get you off the hook. Don't worry.
People are looking very antsy. That's
we actually had one more. Question, but there's no way you guys can answer it. So we're not going to even answer it tonight. But we have a whole conference. The last question we had was, how can we know for sure that Christianity is true? And I don't think we can answer that in the 10 seconds we have. So
let's meet a coffee shop and we'll try to figure it out together. Okay.
And but we will be trying to approach more and more of that question. In a world of 10,000 religions, can Christ be the only way?